Okay. Hello and welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are viewing this. So welcome to today's webinar. It's the second part of a two-series webinar on gender challenges in zoonotic infections. So on behalf of the organizing committee, I would like to thank all of you who woke up early or who are staying up a bit late towards the end of the day to join us. And my name is Indah, and I am going to be chairing this session. I'm the Deputy Coordinator for the Malaysia One Health University Network. And we also have our beloved coordinator, Prof. Latifah Hassan, with us this morning. And also, I would like to welcome the leader for Gender and One Health Activities for MyOHUN, Prof. Rashid. All right, so for the benefit of those who are not familiar with MyOHUN, who we are and what we do, so basically we are the Malaysia One Health University Network, as the name says, and the establishment was initiated back in 2012 as part of the regional network for the Southeast Asia One Health University Network, or better known as MyOHUN. So we aim to promote collaboration amongst national universities, private institutions, and also government agencies in coming from the fields of animal, human, and environmental health together to prepare and combat and respond to new and emerging diseases. So today we are very lucky as we have a lineup of three or four brilliant One Health players who will be sharing their insights and I believe some experiences and data from their projects and work revolving zoonotic disease, infections, and gender. So before we get started, I'm just going to go through a few housekeeping rules to ensure that we'll be having a smooth webinar. So firstly, as always in all webinars, hope that you're ensure that you are on mute to avoid any interruptions during the presentation. And would like to inform you that this webinar will be recorded and is being recorded right now, is it? Okay. And there will be three presentations and each presentation will take about 30 minutes each by our respective panel of experts and followed by the discussion and Q&A session towards the end. So to all of you participants, if you wish to ask the presenters a question, we would welcome you to type in your questions in the chat box, and then we will be collecting all the questions, and then we'll be addressing the questions at the end of the session, okay? All right, so integrating gender in the epidemiology study of zoonotic diseases is critical and should be considered at every level of One Health workforce, either during planning, during developing the policy, implementing any programs, and evaluating such programs. But to some researchers, considering gender in their projects might be pushing them into some unfamiliar territories or make them go like, how is it related? How do I put the gender aspect into what I'm already doing? So, which brings us to today's program. And MyOHUN is striving towards gender-sensitive programs and activities in achieving gender equality. So we are bringing you the second and final part of the live webinar series. So if you still remember, if you have attended the first series of this webinar in early April, at that time we focused more on introducing the concepts of gender, some examples of applied gender concepts, and towards the end, there was a bit of an introduction to gender role in zoonotic diseases. As for today, we will be focusing more on why we should not neglect gender in studying zoonotic infections and how these findings are beneficial in developing prevention, surveillance, and responses programs to zoonotic diseases. All right, so I think we are ready for our first presenter. All right, so let's begin. First up, we have Dr. Kevin Olival. So he is the Vice President for Research at EcoHealth Alliance, which is a non-profit organization developing science-based solutions to prevent pandemics and promote conservation, and also One Health Workforce Next Generation Global Partner. He's been involved in research for the past 18 years, focusing on understanding the drivers of zoonotic disease emergence, characterizing biodiversity in wildlife, and also developing models and analytical approaches to inform policies for disease mitigation. So he has been at the forefront of disease ecology research in coronaviruses in Southeast Asia, China, and Western Asia and Middle East. He's also involved in Nipah virus work in Bangladesh and Malaysia and filoviruses. So for over a decade, he has served as a lead scientist on the 30-country USAID PREDICT project in overseeing modeling and data analysis for forecasting disease emergence and prioritizing surveillance. So I know that he will be teaming up with Stephanie Martinez together presenting on their talk entitled One Health Approach to Understand the Role of Gender in Zoonotic Disease Risk, a case study from USA. So Dr. Kevin and Stephanie, I would like to welcome you.
Thank you, Inda. Good afternoon, good evening to everybody. Can you hear me okay? And can you see my slides okay?
Yes.
Full screen? Great.
Yes.
So thanks for that wonderful introduction and really a pleasure to be part of this gender workshop. You know, I admit that I'm not the foremost expert on gender issues, but as Indola will remind us later, you don't need to be an expert. I think we need everyone's inclusion with addressing gender in One Health. And I've actually learned a lot in the process of preparing for this. So like you, I am also learning. But I have been involved with Predict for over 10 years. And so we're going to use the USAID Predict project, which is separate from the One Health Workforce project, as an example of some of the research that we've conducted on One Health and zoonotic diseases and how we can integrate our understanding of gender into that effort and through that project. So with that, I'd like to really thank my co-authors listed here on the opening page. Tom Hughes from EcoHealth Alliance / Conservation Medicine in Malaysia, and the team that includes Meiho Lee and Velsri Sharmini, who are really have been key in putting these slides together, especially the slides towards the end of the presentation that I'll show you from some data from Malaysia. And Stephanie Martinez will co-present this, as you said, so I'm looking forward. After I go for a few slides, she'll jump in there. So just a little overview of today's outline will be, I'll start with introductions on, thinking about One Health disease surveillance and where does gender fit into that. Will
I'm
be
sorry,
sort of the introduction.
Kevin, to interrupt, but you're, yeah.
Oh, it moved back, huh?
You're not in the
Okay.
presentation. Yeah, okay, all right.
Now it's okay? Okay.
Yeah.
So One Health disease surveillance and gender as an overview. Stephanie will present on some of the Predict2 project highlights across the world. So looking at gender, some of the data we've collected globally for the project. And then I'll wrap up with some insights from this study in Kinabatangan, thanks to our colleagues, EcoHealth colleagues in Malaysia. And just a couple slides on take-home messages and conclusions of things to think about for the discussion and for the Q&A. So just the overview. I think I don't need to explain to the MyOHUN group what One Health is, but One Health can mean many things. And, I think for me, I tend to think of it in terms of primarily zoonotic disease emergence, right? The movement of pathogens from animals to people via some environmental factor. But there's lots of different aspects to One Health, including policy and advocacy. And really what One Health is about bringing stakeholders together, multidisciplinary work and research. And to that end, it's really, I think, a lot of analogous to a lot of the issues with gender that we want to think and talk about in terms of bringing people to the table that maybe weren't present before, and thinking broadly about gender across all different sectors. And so, I think if you look back at historically at disease research and especially integrating gender with disease research, there's really been kind of follows the overall, I guess, level of effort into like priorities of research and disease in general. So there's been quite a bit of work on thinking about non-communicable diseases like heart disease and gender and how do gender norms play into like your lifestyle and your society and behavior with obesity or, heart disease. there's also been a decent amount of work looking at communicable diseases in terms of other sort of what we think of as typically non-zoonotic diseases, although HIV is originally a zoonotic disease, but diseases that move from person to person. So how does gender play into our social contact networks? Obviously, with sexually transmitted diseases like HIV, it's also an intersection between um, sexual preference and gender, and that's all tied together. And so there's been interesting research on that. And also thinking about differences in seeking treatment or, willingness to seek treatment and how that differs by gender in health in general. But really, in terms of One Health, it's not an overwhelmingly huge field of research. And when you start addressing the cross section of One Health and zoonotic diseases and gender, so I think there's a lot of opportunity for you all as students or professors to really expand this area of research. And in particular, it's not about necessarily human to human intersections of gender, but in terms of social networks, but it's about human animal contacts and how can we use the lens of gender to better understand the risk from zoonotic spillover by looking at human animal contacts. And so that's what I'm going to focus on today. And let's see, sorry about this. Okay. So, we think a lot about what we call the drivers of disease emergence or the underlying sort of environmental factors, human induced, we call anthropogenic, right? Where human caused environmental change that is driving new diseases to emerge. And while we still don't know how and where every single emerging zoonotic disease came from and why, over, 50, 70 years of research, some of it driven by my organization, EcoHealth Alliance, we've gotten a much better picture of what drives new disease emergence. And those are primarily human change to the ecosystems and humans really impacting our environment and coming into contact with wildlife directly through these various behaviors. For example, bushmeat hunting and the wildlife trade, wildlife farming and wet markets where you're bringing species together and you're selling those animals and slaughtering them in markets. Of course, climate change and interacting through agricultural development and deforestation and the intensification of agriculture. These are all the primary sort of underlying factors that are causing new zoonotic diseases to emerge. And within each of them, right, it's really about human behavior because we are interacting with the environment and with wildlife. And there's a gender lens we can put on that to better understand those behaviors and interactions. And so these are some figures from our overall surveillance strategy under the PREDICT project and just One Health surveillance in general. On the left, showing you just kind of a schematic thinking about there's diseases or viruses circulating in wildlife. Sometimes those cross into livestock populations and might cause an outbreak in livestock. And there's also viruses or pathogens that move between wildlife species or even between different livestock species. But then occasionally you have emergence, which is what we think of with human emergence. And sometimes that's just a few people that get infected and then the pathogen sort of dies out. So there's kind of these little waves of infection. And sometimes, as we unfortunately know now with SARS-CoV-2, it can cause an epidemic or even a pandemic. And that pandemic stage is really linked to global travel and trade patterns, which themselves actually have some gender factors at play in terms of who moves around more, dispersal from the home to the workplace, and how pathogens might move once they're in the human population. But it's really about this pre-emergence surveillance in terms of thinking about human exposure to novel pathogens at the source is really something we're most interested in. So that piece there. And by the time you're finding the virus in people, it's a little too late. That's kind of what this curve is showing you. You're thinking about the peak of the epidemic curve once you start recognizing all the human cases. But what really, I think, what is a forward-thinking aspect of One Health is moving to what we call the left side of the curve, towards this area, where the human-animal spillover or viral sharing happens. So just a quick anecdote. My colleague John Epstein and I went over to Saudi Arabia back in 2013, right after MERS coronavirus first emerged. And, that was a very interesting experience for me. It was really the first sort of, disease investigation that I was part of as a disease was unfolding. But by the time we got to MERS, there were only about 2 known cases. I think there was initially 1 known human case of MERS, where they identified the virus. And I think by the time we got to Saudi Arabia, there were like 2 or maybe 3 known cases. So it was very early on in the outbreak and the investigation, and we went there to try and understand what were the zoonotic reservoirs or sources, of this virus, and where did it come from. But one thing that struck us, as we started seeing the data come in over the course of this investigation, over 2 different trips to Saudi Arabia and over a few months, was there was a predominance of men being infected by MERS that were, being detected and diagnosed with MERS. And so we thought of a couple things. Well, one, maybe that gives us clues as to where they're getting exposed to the virus, thinking about some of the norms and practices, that were typical of men in that society in terms of workplace and occupation. But it also could have reflected health-seeking behavior, in that perhaps women were being infected, but because of some of the restrictions in place, particularly in Saudi Arabia at the time, that women were not going to hospital, because really the society really was not, as inclusive of them, just sort of going on their own to seek health behavior, health advice. For example, women couldn't even drive, in Saudi Arabia at the time, which has changed now. But well, so that was early on. So now we have a lot of data. This is from the WHO, and looking at, just the gender balance of MERS cases, it's definitely male skewed, right? There's up to, in any given year, up to 85, 100% of men being infected versus women for MERS-CoV-2. And I think surveillance has gotten a lot better since then. But we know now, which we did not know when we first went, that camels are the primary reservoir for MERS. And if you look at the camel industry in these countries, it is really a male-driven, male-dominated, occupational risk that's probably driving the primary spillover of MERS, right? Where the men are the ones, carrying primarily, selling, trading the cattle, and being involved with slaughterhouse work and things like that. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Stephanie to take it from there, and then I'll join you back in a little bit. So thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. So I hope that everyone is coming in today with ideas in mind from their own experiences for why they know it's critical to explore this really special intersection of gender and One Health. One that I wanted to touch on in particular is how valuable a strong gender focus can be for intervention development. So in a lot of the work that we do, we're aiming really to generate evidence that will be useful and that will be actionable for local policymakers and also program creators. And an important part of that is being able to share evidence about specific segments of the population who, through the data, show a strength or a gap that might be a great opportunity for a funded public health program. And gender can and absolutely should be a huge part of this. So, for example, if the data show that some specific community has a strong tradition of wildlife hunting, but also has gaps in their knowledge of zoonoses, perhaps they'd be a great candidate for an education program around disease transmission. That's a pretty broad program. But if your data is able to create insights into how behaviors and knowledge and attitudes break down even further among different groups in this community, particularly by gender and segmented further, these programs could be more specific and potentially more powerful. So again, going with this example, perhaps this is a community where bats are primarily hunted by men and rodents are primarily slaughtered at home by, let's say, adolescent girls. Based upon that, something like a community workshop focused on rodent-borne diseases marketed mostly to male hunters, and that takes place in the middle of the day during school hours, might not be one that makes sense. Maybe we know that where adult men, adult women, adolescent girls, and adolescent boys get health information that they actually believe and trust is different. You know, maybe adults trust the TV news more while adolescents prefer to trust what they get through SMS. I certainly see that in my own life sometimes. Maybe boys prefer getting information through Facebook and girls through WhatsApp or something. That could be a great piece of research and knowledge generated used in tailoring a gender-informed communications outreach program. So being purposeful and really meaningfully making gender a central part of research design and later on analyses is such a crucial part of building smart interventions based upon these kinds of insights. And to successfully sort of get to this endpoint, an important consideration is to really think about and include and integrate gender from the absolute beginning of your project. So from when the project objectives are being defined, from the beginning when the research tools, so things like surveys, interview guides, focus group guides, when those are like being developed from scratch or searched for, and when the research team itself is being trained as well. Some of these considerations are obvious, some are not, some you have to keep on reminding yourselves, which is why the conversation about gender in your research and the work that you do should always sort of be present and ongoing. Next slide. So we're happy to share with you some insights from our work under Predict. And I wanted to start off by introducing our behavioral risk approach before we look at some of our Malaysia-specific data. So Predict is a project of the USAID Emerging Pandemic Threats Program. And the goal of our project was to strengthen the global capacity for detecting and discovering zoonotic viruses of pandemic potential. And we collaborated with scientists from many countries, and our partners from throughout the Asia region are listed here on this slide. And one of the components of our work was conducting behavioral risk investigations, where local teams used things like surveys, interviews, and focus groups to engage with individuals from local communities working in high-risk occupations and living in high-risk areas of potential zoonotic disease transmission. So these included people who worked along the wildlife value chain, so people like hunters, vendors, consumers, transporters, butchers, those who worked with guano, and other individuals who had frequent contact with our taxa of interest. Next slide. So our approach with our behavioral risk work was mixed methods. So we had quantitative and qualitative tools. Our quantitative tool was a main survey, and our qualitative tools facilitated the interviews, the one-on-one interviews, and the focus groups. So this qualitative component was conducted in a subset of all of the countries where we were doing our survey behavioral risk work. So not every country was able to do both, but some were. Over the course of the project, globally, we completed more than 20,000 surveys, over 1,000 one-on-one interviews, and facilitated over 100 focus groups with over 1,000 individuals. For the questionnaires, we were almost equal in terms of female and male respondents. You could see some of the numbers on the screen here. For the interviews, it was a little bit more skewed, with about 40% of interviews with female respondents and 60% with male respondents, for reasons that you could probably imagine. And aiming for gender representation with our participants was built into our study design from the beginning. We set targets in our research planning documents so that everyone was reminded during the recruitment stage of how important it was to actively try to recruit both men and women, even when it wasn't always the easiest thing to do because of sensitivities in the local context. And one strategy that was helpful for us was that when possible, our teams really tried to match female survey staff with female respondents and male staff with male respondents to ensure comfort in answering questions and sort of local acceptability. However, as we worked across several different countries with the same tool, but with different beliefs, even that approach itself wasn't acceptable to everyone. For example, in some contexts, it was found potentially more problematic for a woman to be interviewing a woman. And this just speaks again to how dynamic gender considerations are in research design and how it really needs to be incorporated and meticulously thought through and probed from the beginning stages, particularly in collaboration with researchers from the local area where the work's going to be conducted, and whenever possible, key informants from the local community who can give you some tips and insights as well. Next slide. So just to give you a flavor of some of the things that we were looking at, across PREDICT, we found that, or across PREDICT countries, we found that the breakdown of males and females working in animal production was pretty even, with 52% represented by males and 48% by females. However, when looking at other occupations that were related to handling animals, this wasn't always the case. For example, among slaughterhouse workers, almost 70% were male. And of individuals who reported that they worked in the wild animal trade or in wild animal markets, males were also the majority, making up 79%. Among the hunters that were interviewed by PREDICT teams across the various countries, 72% were male. Among the respondents from our Africa partner countries, those who worked in wildlife restaurants were overwhelmingly female at just over 90%. But among our Asia partner countries, this was a little bit more even, with about 53% represented by males. Gender, education, nor the type of animal hunted were found to be significantly related to PPE use, which is also interesting. Next slide. So a little bit about an example from two of our countries. In Cote d'Ivoire, our data showed that hunting and livestock breeding were carried out exclusively by men in both rural and urban areas. On the other hand, in more urban areas, women dominated the value chain that was related to the animal business, particularly wildlife trade and wild animal restaurants. Men were also more involved in agricultural activities than women, who in our behavioral risk findings describe spending more of their time at home carrying out domestic tasks that didn't involve working with live animals. And then in Bangladesh, and this is more from our qualitative work, macaques were almost universally regarded by all as bothersome and were often described as coming frequently into sort of domestic spaces, so places like the kitchen and laundry areas and indoors. And in these spaces around dwellings and in the community, physical contact such as bites, pinches, slaps, and other direct contact were frequently reported. Many female respondents also described the men of the family, most often the husband, as the person who was responsible for shopping for things like the meats. And while many women described sort of the out-of-house shopping as the purview, the responsibility of the husband and occasionally the sons of the family, some women also talk about purchasing poultry and fish from door-to-door vendors. So an interesting example of maybe different kinds of animal meats that different groups were coming into contact with. As you can see, many of the countries in PREDICT generated some really fascinating insights with really strong, interesting, some surprising, some not gender components. And something that I think PREDICT really set the stage for was for further lines of inquiry for future researchers, particularly with regard to these kinds of findings that fell along really interesting gender lines. Our limitation was that a lot of our tools had to work across several countries, across urban, across rural areas. So we really couldn't be always as specific as we wanted to be. But I think that our work that we did really built a case for further investigation of gender-specific questions that can be explored about the kinds of unique risks that men and women face, that girls and boys face, such as the differences in access to risk mitigation resources and other kinds of questions that we could be asking, you know, the possibilities of what can be done kind of based off of these initial findings are endless. There are many, and we're really heartened that there are so many people here today who will kind of carry that flag forward. And so with that, I'll turn it over back to Kevin.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. That was excellent and really, really spot on specific examples. I really liked your examples about the interventions, especially in the beginning as well. So I think that will lead to a lot of rich discussion, a lot of the points you brought up. So thanks for that. Okay, so I'm going to shift now. Well, continue really what Stephanie was showing you with some of the global examples from the predict behavioral research and focus on something obviously of interest, I hope, to MyOHUN, which is some of our data from Malaysia, from Sabah specifically, looking at some insights from work in the Kinabatangan. So thank you again to Tom, Velsri, Meho, who put this together. And I encourage my colleagues from EcoHealth in Malaysia to jump in where relevant in terms of giving us some insights. If I misrepresent anything, please correct me. And we can kind of work through this together. Otherwise, you guys will be present for the Q&A, and I hope that you can chime in on some of the details of this work. So we had a project under Predict that we called Deep Forest. And the goal of Deep Forest was to really understand how does disease risk change across a deforestation or a land use gradient. So we had designed both animal sampling and sampling of people and administering questionnaires to people across sort of pristine forest environment, more degraded or sort of semi-rural environment, and then more urban areas or more developed areas. And we had replicates within each of those different types of land use change. So it's an interesting study design to get at some of the ecological drivers of disease emergence, but it also allowed us to look at some of the social drivers of disease emergence and thinking about how are people interacting with, say, wildlife across that gradient. And so this will be information from that deep forest part of our project from Malaysia. And I should say we did deep forest in just 3 countries under Predict. And the idea was to do a replicate site on each continent. So we had Brazil, we had Malaysia, and we had Uganda for different rainforest environments. So overall, the graph here on the left is showing you just the number of people that we trained in Malaysia under Predict. Not exclusive to Deep Forest, but the entire project, with pretty equal balance, but 46% female. And then this is the respondents to our questionnaires that we administered in the Kinabatangan, which was a little more skewed towards men, with 42% females. Okay, I know we're getting close to time. I don't think we started a few minutes late, so I'll just go through these, trying it fairly quickly, but I want you to have a little time to be able to read the graph. So I'm going to go through a series of questions that were part of our questionnaires that we've cross-sectioned, thanks to the Malaysia team, by looking at male, female, and addressing gender on top of that. One thing to note, we didn't actually have a specific question about gender in terms of self-identifying for gender. Gender was determined during our questionnaires by the interviewer, the person giving the interview. And so it was primarily a determination based on biological sex, right? And not necessarily how they self-identify with gender. So that's just something to note. But I think Ndola will touch on that issue later as well. So again, based on that, looking at primary occupations by gender, you see that we had a little more of a skew towards, in some cases, towards most obvious one there is working in oil palm plantations, which was a much more male-dominated activity than female. And the other big bar here is the category other, right? Where people didn't have a choice in the sort of question, the multiple choice that really fit what they do for a living as their primary occupation. And this was actually a big lesson learned for our behavioral work under Predict. And maybe it was an area where we should have considered gender a little more at the onset, because it was 63% of women marked other, as opposed to 51% of men who marked it. And of those who marked other, many of those responses a large proportion of them were homemaker, right? Or that, we work out of the home, and we did not even have that as a sort of a category to begin with, which was probably an oversight, and it would have changed our data a little bit. And so I think, yeah, having, contextually appropriate categories for occupation was important. But as Stephanie pointed out, a lot of the goal of Predict was looking across many countries around the world. So we had to sacrifice a little specificity. Like, we didn't necessarily just have Malaysia specific occupations on the list. We had all occupations that we thought were relevant for human animal interface and interactions. Okay, I'm going to move on. Next question was, what animals have you touched or have you've been touched by the animal? And we have another specific question about being bitten or scratched by animals. But basically, what animals are you coming into contact with? And one thing that's interesting out of this is that people didn't acknowledge a lot of wildlife contact, or they skipped the question entirely. And so that could potentially be, not how we asked the question, but rather a cultural factor of maybe they were embarrassed about eating wildlife, or maybe it was because it's illegal. There was a fear of some retribution from admitting that you had interacted with wildlife. So, I think it could be a sensitive question when you're talking about dealing with wildlife trade or wildlife hunting. And again, that was a lesson learned, not specific to gender, but something to think about as we were trying to understand human-animal contact, and making sure that people were really comfortable in the interview context as much as possible to get those truthful answers.
Kevin, just to add in there, Tom
Yeah,
here from
Tom. Yeah,
Malaysia.
Tom, please.
I mean, one of the other things about this was that before we were asked to do this survey, we'd been working with these communities for a number of years. So we'd spent a lot of time talking to these communities about zoonosis, about the risk posed by hunting and butchering and consuming wildlife. So in some way, that kind of created a bit of a bias, because when it came to the BCI team then asking these questions, people were thinking back, well, hang on a minute, they've been telling us for a few years we shouldn't do this. So therefore, that was where a lot of that kind of reluctance to answer those questions came from.
Thanks, Tom. That's a great point. Yeah, and it's how are you? Yeah, exactly. What are the biases going into it with your population? And in this case, probably a good thing that we were sensitizing them, right, of the risk and the awareness, but it did change the outcome. That's a really great point. Thank you. Next slide. How do you usually prepare meat before eating? And what we were trying to get at was, because the risk of zoonotic disease transmission from directly transmitted zoonoses is likely quite low from cooking an animal, we want to get a better sense of both handling animals, raw meat, and also who actually might even eat raw meat, which may not be common in Malaysia, but certainly happens in some countries. So the answer was no. Primarily, there's almost no raw meat consumption by gender. Seems to be a rare activity. But there were a small handful of people who actually answered yes. And while it's a small sample size, 5 men and 3 women answered yes. So again, could be an opportunity to further explore meat preference and who's handling restrictions by gender. So for example, who in society is allowed to butcher which animals, who buys the raw meat, and who eats what. And further questions probing those would be actually relevant to better understand that risk. Just as a comparison, in Thailand, eating raw meat, and this is by lifetime, by gender, again, the majority said no, but there were actually a lot more, it is a neighboring country to Malaysia, but culturally quite different in that actually quite a bit of raw meat consumption, again, probably related to cultural and religious norms. But you see just across the border, there's a very different picture that could arise from this particular activity in thinking about zoonotic disease risk. And again, sort of male dominated in terms of about 3 times as many men answered yes. How often do you enter the forest? And what we were trying to get at here was exposure, maybe through the deforestation pathway or the land use change pathway for disease emergence. And, men, if you look at the bars here, men appeared to, at a daily level, men were the only ones who said, yes, I go into the forest every day. 16 men answered yes to that. And they overall answered more frequently yes to a few times a week, few times a month. So men generally appear to be entering the forest more regularly. But how people are interacting with the forest is still an open question, and could the activities may differ as they're going into the forest. And we probed some of that with our research, but there could be more work done on that. What are the specific activities when you're out there, and how are you interacting with animals? Do you know, or anyone else eat non-domesticated animals in the past? And you can answer for yourself or for others. So we're trying to get a sort of a population estimate of consumption of wildlife. And men overall in Kinabatangan were more likely to eat wildlife than women. So you can see the responses here. It's pretty clear as a yes, no, or not answered. And 43 respondents left this blank. So they're, again, speaking to the previous point about sensitivity, could have been an issue with people not feeling comfortable answering that. Or maybe, as Tom pointed out, they had, they had some knowledge before, and maybe if they had eaten wildlife, they were afraid to say it because they knew that they shouldn't have, because we kind of pre-sensitized them to understanding disease risk in zoonoses. This is a question on, have you ever been bitten, scratched, or injured by a wildlife animal? Again, most people know, but there are several interesting cases of, yes, being bitten and scratched, primarily bitten. And in terms of actually being bitten, more frequent in men versus women. So here we actually looked, thanks to, again, to Tom, Mayho, and Velstri for looking at creating this graph. We looked at both the number of people who answered yes or no, and also the proportion of men versus women that answered yes or no. So one thing that's interesting, and this is just something to think about for data analysis in general, how are you viewing your gender cross-section data is really important. So if you look at just the raw data, remember we had a slight bias towards the number of men we interviewed versus the number of females. So we didn't have perfectly equal sample sizes with the interviews. But when you look at proportion, actually the proportion who answered no is higher with female, whereas the number who answered no is higher with men. So just something to think about for analyses and how we look at this. And just as another cross-border comparison, now to the south in Indonesia, similar question rather, but just like a yes, no on being bitten or scratched. And we see that a higher proportion of men said yes to being bitten or scratched overall in the communities that we interviewed in Indonesia. Now, this is not to say that all of Indonesia has more wildlife contact than all of Malaysia, but it's specific to the communities we were working with, at these communities in Indonesia where a lot of bat hunting was going on. It was a much more common for that community we were interviewing for them to be bitten or scratched by animals. So not only actual contact and assessing contact by gender is important, but also thinking about perception of risk, right? So what is your risk tolerance? And the data suggests that there are different risk tolerances between men and women. How much risk are you willing to take, right, in terms of zoonotic disease? And we also, I think a really important point from this graph is that, the question was how risky is butchering an animal, right, for disease risk? And more women than men said, I don't know. And so that sort of willingness to admit that you don't know the answer is a potential opening for intervention development. And maybe the females in that community are a better target for educational material that they could spread amongst the community and share amongst their friends, colleagues, and family, because they're willing to accept that they maybe don't know the answer to that risk and interested in learning more. And this is just, again, another global comparison. This is from Liberia in West Africa, and thinking about just how your opinion can actually change over time. So we actually asked the same question about whether or not people were worried about disease outbreaks in the market, live animal market, before the West Africa Ebola outbreak, during the outbreak, and then a couple years after the outbreak. And in general, men and women were pretty aligned in terms of their concern about disease risk in Liberia. And you see it, obviously, it went way up during the outbreak, but then people kind of quickly forgot about it. So we humans have short attention spans sometimes. And that's something to just think about for intervention development, that you need to repeatedly get the message across, even outside of outbreak situations. I think this is my last slide before the take homes. So this is a question about awareness of disease risk from hunting. In other words, just like with the butchering question, if you're out there hunting animals, does that pose a risk to you in terms of getting a disease? And a lot of people thought no, interestingly. But quite a few, about a third of the people said yes. And this is looking at proportions. We thought this was a better way to view this particular data set, was looking at proportions. And again, some did not answer, acknowledging they did not know, probably. And another point, as I just made, about an intervention point when they admit that they don't know if there's a risk or not. And I should note that even the people who said, no, there's no disease risk, there's also an intervention point there. But they may be a little less willing to accept new information if they already kind of have their mindset that, oh no, it's a safe activity. And the people that said yes, there still could also be additional education and intervention that could go to that segment of the population, and relatively equal across men and women. Okay, time to wrap it up. I know we're getting on with, we're almost about actually at 40 minutes in, so I apologize for that. Cut into the Q&A time a little bit. So I think we've hit a number of points in this talk. That Stephanie made some great points about interventions and how can we use data from gender and investigations from gender to understand intervention points and disease mitigation. And it's critical that you consider gender very carefully at the onset of your project. So when you're writing the questionnaire, it needs to be at the forefront of your mind when you're designing the study. And that there can be trade-offs in tools when you're looking at, say, a very specific community is the sole focus of your study versus a global study like PREDICT, where your questions had to be a little bit more generic so that they could be compared across countries. And that there's a key need for mixed method research where the questionnaires tell you one thing, but really understanding the community through focus groups and the in-depth interviews is important to contextualize your data and understand it. And I think working with our EcoHealth Malaysia team in doing this data analysis obviously is another point where they are way more familiar with the communities than certainly I am. If you were to just give me the data set to analyze, you want to have someone who really has the context for the community and the answers as you're looking and analyzing the data. And female, an important point, I think Ndola will probably touch on this as well. Female is not a single category. You need to think about the intersection of age. So adolescent females, child females are all going to be different than just saying, oh, it's, there's a pattern here with females in general. And, I think we're going to touch on this throughout the next couple talks. So I think really key things to keep in mind for the webinar going forward are really about representation. How can we bring better gender representation to projects, to One Health projects and zoonotic disease research projects? How can you meaningfully engage with communities to ensure that you're getting participation from both genders in the community or all the genders in the community, whether it's more than two, but also making sure that you can understand that intersection of disease risk and gender. And that goes to when you're designing the tools and when you're building your research team as well. And everyone can contribute to this important issue. And thank you very much for your time. Thanks to the MyOHUN organizers. And I apologize that I'm going to need to run away, but my colleagues from Malaysia and Stephanie will be on for the Q&A session. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kevin and Stephanie. And yeah, so that was such an insightful talk. So it really set the scene as to what we are going to be listening next. So some of the key points is that And in understanding the drivers and emergence of zoonotic diseases, it will be really important to incorporate gender lens, especially at the beginning, in planning, in designing the project, the research, so that it wouldn't, be causing any sort of like issues or difficulties later on when you are already beginning with the research. And then, yeah, so incorporating it from the beginning, and a stronger focus on gender, and then with the many subgroups in terms of, as Kevin mentioned towards the end, that female is not just a single group. So that's really an eye-opening as well, because it really looks into the age of the female person that you are trying to approach, that you're trying to empower, and trying to educate them with preventive measures. Okay, so moving on, we will be having Associate Professor Dr. Muhammad Razak Hassan. He's currently serving as the head for the Department of Community Health at the Faculty of Medicine, University Kebangsaan Malaysia. And he specialized in epidemiology and medical statistics. And Dr. Razak is also actively involved in research in a range of infectious disease epidemiology, be it tropical, neglected tropical diseases, zoonotic infections, and also outbreak management. And he's also actively part of a team empowering community members as volunteers to fight and prevent TB. And other examples of his work is being involved in looking to the risk factors, epidemiology for malaria, dengue, and leptospirosis. So more recently, he has been playing a very active role in helping and managing, coordinating the response to its COVID-19 outbreak in Malaysia. So let us welcome Dr. Razak. He will be sharing his talk entitled Gender-Related Risks in Zoonotic Infections. So Dr. Razak, I welcome you.
So thank you very much, Indah, for your kind introductions. Thank you to the organizing committee for giving me the opportunity just to share what is all about risk in zoonotic infections. Basically, what Kevin has given in the introductions covers most of the slides that I'm going to show you, but sharing a local experience on One Health and gender-related diseases is very much interesting. Can you hear me clearly, Indah?
Yes, all good.
Yeah, okay. So basically, I've been involved in MyOHUN for the past 10 years, but when gender issues being highlighted, I think 1.5 years ago, about 1.5 years ago, is something very new. And I bet you that all, especially the young researchers, we are not looking into the gender issues when talking about zoonotic infections, especially because I think most of our epidemiological research looking into the sex rather than gender. We are looking into the biological functions rather than the role functions. And most of the studies is looking at male or female as the confounders to any of the factors associated with the diseases. But interestingly, when these gender issues coming in, then we can see that there's a lot more opportunities to see, not only to control it as a confounders or looking into that, okay, which is more affected, male or female, but looking into their role and dig more on what caused this and what caused that. So it's a very interesting topics. It's a very interesting field to dig in as a researcher. So basically, my talk today is not going to be long. Okay, looking at why gender matters in zoonotic disease, and we look into the basic concepts on the risk factors in zoonotic infections, and let's look into what are the gender-related risks. Okay. Basically, of course, I don't have any data to share. It is something very new to me personally. I'm not the gender experts. I'm looking into more on the disease epidemiology, disease prevention and control. But to be honest, that for a few years that we are not looking in depth on the gender role in determining the disease. in terms of interventions. We're just looking at all other factors rather than looking at the gender role itself as the main domain to tackle the infectious disease. Okay, so why gender matters in the zoonotic infections? Okay, I would like to share on the eco-health approach, which is a core concept in integrating the environmental aspects of human and animal health. In One Health, this is very important that for diseases to occur, we have so many zoonotic diseases. So we have to look on where are the integrations between the environment with the human and animal health. So basically, there's a lot of things with why gender matters. Okay, one is of course lack of gender sensitivity. Okay, on when we design the disease surveillance, control, and response, because we don't focus so much on the gender role. Okay, and we are not looking in depth on the how men and women impact on the environment differently, and also how the ecosystem change the role of men and women in their daily roles. So we are not looking in depth when we did the epidemiological studies. Okay, but mainly we are looking at the risk of infection between men and women. Okay? The risk of how men, whether men is higher to get this disease and women or vice versa. So, well, if we look at the classical agent host environment triad, okay, we can see this is examples of cryptosporidiasis. We can see that gender is of course is a host factor. Okay, and under the host factor, we have so many intrinsic factors which can lead to the zoonotic infections. But at the same time, we have all these agent factors, the pathogenic factors, and environmental factors. So with this triad, we can expand more, not looking only at the host environment, host agent environment interactions, but we should look further on the significant role of gender itself within the host factor. Okay, the significant role of gender in the classical triad of the infectious disease. Within the host factor, how gender, not only biologically, but by role perspective, by gender and male or female as a role, functions, and at the same time interact with pathogens, with the agents, and also with the environment. So you can see that it is it's kind of complex of human-animal interactions, but led by the gender factor. Okay, for example, if we look into the examples from studies in Nairobi, exposure to Cryptosporidium was influenced by gender, age, and role in the household. Not only the gender, but and age, but the role in the household. Okay, if we can see, for example, if we are talking about malaria, we always say that for null-side malaria, men is more affected because they are working outdoors. Okay, but if you can share what Kevin has shared with us just now, Stephanie shared with us just now, the predict findings and findings in Bangladesh showing that the macaque is more interested to female. So why? Then the hypothesis came in that okay, malaria is increasing because man is going outside to work. They are approaching the monkey, but the macaque itself is approaching us and more interested in female. Why? Because the role of female may be involving in food preparing. As you can see that if your housing estates is near to the hills or mountain, you can see that I think your kitchen is the first place where all these macaques are coming in. You see that the role itself is it makes the animals approach us. So that kind of things that we have to dig further. Okay. For example, in this case, that women has a greater contact with raw meat because of their role in this community. The role of women is more in doing all the chores regarding the farming. And adult women had more daily contact with the cattle feces than men. It's a socio-cultural that the man is taking role as the role of husbandry, okay, for their livestock, everything, but the women has to clean up all the feces from the animals. So those kind of social and gender determinants in terms of risk exposure. okay, if you look at the social and roles based on gender, okay, men and women carry out different activities, okay, because of the gender norms in the society. Okay. For example, in rural areas, men are more likely to be involved in hunting, commercialing crops, livestock productions, okay, compared to the women. Okay. And the second one is human and animal disease impact on men and women differently. Okay. If we can see that for these two examples, one is a plague in Tanzania. In their culture, that the girls are sleeping on the mat of the floor, and the boys is sleeping on beds. So because of this, then the interactions of human animal disease impact is different, where all these fleas, okay, fleas biting disease are more among the girls compared to the boys. Okay? And in 2001 and 2002, okay, they found out that during the outbreak of Ebola in Congo and Gabon, okay, men in contact with the infected primates, okay, because they are hunters, okay, and of course they are become infected and cause the outbreak. But women exposed because their role of taking care of the sick people at home, okay, at the health center. Some of them becoming the traditional healers or some shaman, and also as a midwife. So you can see that the role of the gender is very important in determining the risk for the disease. And the other thing is the nutrition. Okay, nutrition. Women, okay, are actually the main playing the main role in providing food. Okay. But in one of the study, they shows that they don't have liberty in deciding their own nutrition. Okay, because they prepare the food, but all the resources is the husband that bringing home. So you see the difference is that even though they are preparing the food, but to decide on the nutrition, everything based on the husband, because the husband is buying everything from the groceries. Okay, and of course, if you are looking at the biological and immunological difference between men and women, I think women are more vulnerable, being of the role of a childbearers and so on. Okay, so when we look into the gender-related risk, okay, when we talk about gender-related risk, okay, there are socio-cultural factors, and also we are looking into the access and control over the resources. Okay, and also the power of decision making in the society, in the family, in the society. Okay, and these factors, these two gender factors, is a huge like domains of factors, will interact with the factors influencing the risk and exposure to the disease. Okay, which normally we can see that these are the things cause increase in incidence and mortality of infectious disease, of zoonotic diseases. Okay, susceptibility and vulnerability of men or women towards the disease, the rate of exposure to the agents. Okay, and that's the two most common. Okay, if we are looking into the socio-cultural factors, in terms of what are their roles, what are their jobs, everything. Okay, and not to forget that on the perceptions, okay, on the perceptions, on the rich communications, on the informations that they can get, also being affected by socio-cultural factors, and of course access to and control over the resources. Who is the dominant in the family, in that particular community? How the culture determines the role of men and women in the community. Okay, and then this will determine the accessibility to healthcare. In fact, in the health-seeking behavior, if you can see that if a woman gets sick, they may not be getting the treatment as early as men, because most of the time women went to clinic just because of the pregnancy or immunization of the child. That's common things seen in certain communities. So compared to men, they are outside, they have a freedom to go. So those cultural in certain communities determine the as a risk of infectious disease. Okay, and of course, health-seeking behavior, including the care and management. Okay, accessibility to care and management, plus the physical, psychological, social factors which determines the infectious diseases. And in the middle, of course, there is a sex or biological role of men and women, especially a woman being the biological roles, pregnancy, breastfeeding. So those factors are also in between these interactions between socio-cultural factors, and accessibility and power control over the resources and decisions. Okay, I would like to share and suggest, because I'm also new in looking at the gender factor in research, in determining the infectious disease, especially the zoonotic disease. But if we adopt this Dalgren-Whitehead model of health determinants, I think it looks feasible to see the complex interaction between gender versus health behavior, social, cultural, economic at different level. As you can see, the interaction between this at the individual level. Of course, now we are looking, most of the researchers, young researchers, is looking at the sex rather than gender, looking at the biological role rather than the social role in determining the disease. So if we look into that, then we can expand from individual looking to the community, and also will involve the working environment, education, water sanitation, everything. And towards as a rule for everything, it will be looking into the socioeconomic, sociocultural, which is the which determine the risk factors for infectious disease. So looking at the gender as a role rather than just a biological role of the sex role, rather than the sociocultural role. Okay? So just to make it short, I think when we discuss about gender-related disease, okay, we should be focusing basically on these two. Okay, the sociocultural, and also we look into the accessibility to and control over resources and decisions. Okay, because that will determine in terms of risk factors towards the infectious disease, especially the zoonotic disease. So these two huge components of domain should be highlighted when we want to discuss about the gender risk factors towards infectious disease. But of course, beside that, we can look into the sex and biological role, okay, of male and female as part of the mediating factors, or if we look that as the co-founders, then we have to dig more on that to show how it really affects. Okay. So thank you very much. It's just a short presentations on that's a basic concept for the new researchers, basically to look into the role of gender in determining the risk of risk for infectious diseases. As mentioned by our colleagues just now, that male or female is not a single entity, but it is more on the role, So those are the things that we should look into now. If you think that male is more prone to have certain diseases rather than female, let's start put a hypothesis that what if I change the role of that particular male, do more of female works, okay, and we interchange it, okay, against the social norms of the population, and see whether the incidence of the infectious disease is the same or not. With that, I thank you. Back to you, Linda.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rahazad. So yes, the previous two talks really summarizes and emphasizes on the importance of considering gender to be looked carefully, and on top of just the usual sex or biological roles, physiological roles in determining or determinants as determinants for the disease. And then yeah, so I think that pretty much ties up to the coming to the next presenter. So we have already looked into the roles of genders in the emergence of zoonotic diseases in a particular community or group. So where do we go from here? Once you've already got the data through the analysis and you see how gender may explain fully or partly of a particular disease occurrence, where should we take? What should we do now? So how do we measure the impact of gender in zoonotic disease transmission, spread, prevention, and control? And how can we make full use of the findings from our gender-sensitive One Health project? Can it help to pave way more to setting up guidelines, effective intervention programs in terms of preventive measures? So before I call upon Prof. Ndola and introduce her, I would like to remind participants to please be asking questions. So we welcome more questions because we're going to be spending a bit more time towards the end with having a discussion with all panels. So keep the questions coming and type it in the chat box. All right, so I would like to introduce Prof. Ndola Prata as our third presenter. So she is a medical professor and medical demographer by profession, but she holds multiple positions and responsibilities in prestigious academic institutions at the University of California, Berkeley. So among the long list are professor in residence at the Division of Community Health Sciences and faculty director at the Bixby Center for Population Health and Sustainability. And she holds a position of co-directors for multiple agencies and institutes. So among it is a Center of Expertise in Women's Health, Gender and Empowerment, and also Global Health Institute and Innovations for Youth at the University of California, Berkeley as well. So a glimpse into her CV makes me feel like very amazed, impressed, and it's just a very long list of accomplishments and then articles in prestigious journals and a wide range of topics related to gender, youth, family planning, maternal health, and also up to war, civil health, and fertility. So it's no coincidence that Prof. Rashid invited Prof. Ndola to speak in today's webinar. So without wasting further time, let's welcome Prof. Ndola, who will be speaking on gender impact on zoonotic diseases, opportunities and challenges for disease prevention, surveillance, and response. So welcome, Prof. Ndola.
Thank you so much, Inda, for such generous presentation, introduction. So I will share my presentation right now. Can you see?
It's still okay. Yes. All right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
maybe
good.
there's a little bit of a delay, but hopefully you can see it now.
Yes. Yeah.
So again, thank you so much, Inda, and all of the organizers for the invitation and allowing me to participate. Is really an honor for me, and because this is the second time. Remember that I was here for the first webinar. So today, what I'm going to focus on is the gender impact on zoonotic diseases, and looking specifically at opportunities, even though the title says challenges. But I like to the challenge is identification of a situation or of a problem. But I like to believe that for every challenge, there is an opportunity. So we will discuss how gender influences and impacts zoonotic diseases, while at the same time reviewing the importance of gender in understanding disease surveillance and response and controlling disease transmission. Both Dr. Kevin and Professor Hassam have made very good points on that. Will be also important to recognize the importance of gender roles in disease prevention that Professor Hassam has already mentioned, and also the importance of gender in monitoring and evaluation of infectious diseases. Now, the importance of gender roles in the prevention of zoonotic diseases. So we know that addressing gender in zoonotic infection prevention programs help to ensure equal access and benefits. So when we talk about gender, as Professor Hassan has mentioned, we're going to focus on roles, behaviors, and all sorts of different activities and responsibilities for both men and women. But having into consideration that those differences are socially constructed so they can change, especially over time. Now, sex specifically, those are biological differences that will not be changed. Now, in terms of the roles and access to that affect exposure to human and animals and the risk of acquiring diseases, just to recap very quickly, so the gender that focus on norms, roles, and responsibilities, but also the decision-making and access to resources, and sex more, you know, we talk about the anatomic differences, the immune system, but also the status of pregnancy. They all affect sort of a key elements and points of intervention for infectious disease transmission, the vulnerability to disease, the exposure to pathogens, response to illness, that ultimately leads to differences in incidence, duration, and severity of the disease expressed in terms of morbidity, mortality, or disability. Now, the differences that we find, for the most part, in terms of how gender influence both the patterns of exposure to infection agents and treatment of diseases, can be categorized in a few areas. The time spent at home and away from home, so associated with the roles and responsibilities of men and women, the responsibility for caring for the sick, the responsibility for caring for livestock, and within that, which types, but also the health care received, the health care seeking behavior, so who goes, who makes the decision, and ultimately the scientific knowledge about treatment and how that affect not just gender, but also the intersection, as Professor Hassan mentioned, with age and with that includes children and adults with pregnancy and also lactating women. Now, there are some specific questions that we can all use to assess how gender affects disease outcomes. And to use those questions in surveys, during outbreak investigation, we don't need to be gender experts. And I hope that by the end of this webinar, that we all realize that we don't need to be gender experts in order to have a gender lens on disease prevention and outbreak investigation. So one of the important questions to ask ourselves is, are there any gender differences in exposure or risk? Are these differences a result of gender norms, some expectations, behaviors, or occupations? Are there gender differences in access to information about the disease? So who gets that information? Are there gender differences in who accesses treatment? Do all genders have the same ability to make decisions to access healthcare services? Also important to know is there are there gender norms or sociocultural perception about who can obtain care, who is responsible for caring for the sick. And also important to know is that does the response to the disease affects gender differently? So we don't have to answer all of it, but some examples, case examples that I will bring today, that we will discuss today, will touch on many of these questions that we'll talk about a little bit later. Now, so in those examples that I prepared, just about, let's see if we can make it to 3 examples. We're going to look at some important factors that influence transmission and disease outcome, vulnerability or susceptibility, exposure, healthcare seeking behavior, response to illness, and then some public health interventions, including communications and access to information. And some of the gender considerations that we will look at will be related to norms and behaviors, to male-female division of labor and activities, professions, and also the role that access and control over resources and decisions in the household make an impact, and in some circumstances, because of the type of disease, the pregnancy status. So the idea here, so usually with more time and with in a larger workshop, I would have presented a full case study. We will be divided into groups and then assess those all together and go over some of those questions based on the evidence that already exists from the literature. Unfortunately, due to time, I'm going to go a little bit quick. So it's not a sort of a talk about the epidemiology of the disease, but we're going to focus on some of those factors as we recap the disease to zone into those gender considerations as examples, so that you can take those examples as a practice for your future teachings or trainings, or even if yourself are part of a program for disease control. Now, the first case is the Nipah virus. So very quickly, this virus has been linked to increased contact between bats and humans. And some of the reasons behind that increased contact has been suggested due to loss of habitat and food availability. So all that drives bats towards human populated areas, but also the encroachment by human agriculture into bats' habitats can also increase exposure. So earlier epidemics in Malaysia were described about in pig farmers or those with contact with pigs. It's a highly contagious disease and spread by coughing. So the virus is also present in bat urine, feces, but also in fruit that is partially be eaten by bats. Can be contaminated, and some of these fruits, in the case of the early epidemic in Malaysia, contaminated pig feed. There are more recent epidemics that I want to go into too much detail in India and Bangladesh. It's a disease that has a very high case fatality rate, and infected patients are hospital staff, visitors assist the patients. There's also suggestion of person-to-person transmission through sharing of utensils with sick, sleeping in their beds, close contact at time of death, and also preparation of the body for burial. So this was very quick, but it gives you a sense of the specific sort of areas where we're going to look at where the opportunities and the challenges, if we miss those opportunities, can become problematic when we design prevention programs or when we try to understand how best to control an epidemic or an outbreak. So if you look at the male division of labor, first question for the Nipah virus is to who handles the host animal? So we saw that for in Malaysia, when it happened among pig farmers, most of the pig farmers were men. So it actually shows that the male to female ratio was 4.5 to 1. In terms of infected people. Now, in other outbreaks where the source of the outbreak started with the drinking of the raw date palm juice, the question was who gathered that? It was also mostly men, and even in a more recent outbreak in Bangladesh of the Nipah encephalitis, boys were more affected under 16 years of age because they are the ones who climbed the trees for the most part that had the fruits that were partially eaten by the bats that were infected. So in this particular case, we see that the men, including the boys, were based on the beginning of how the epidemic started, were the ones more affected. Now, however, there are some gender norms and behaviors related to who cares for the sick. And those were mostly women, and they care for the sick at home, but also in healthcare facilities, a lot of the nurses and the primary healthcare providers are also female. So those who attend to the patients in the beginning of the epidemic tend to be also the ones that get infected. Now, with respect to access and control over decisions and resources, it will vary according to the social context, cultural context, related to, for example, how fast once for example, the young boy gets sick, mom is taking care of the boy, how fast after the incubation period and the fever starts and other symptoms, how fast can she make the decision to take the boy, for example, to the healthcare facility? And that is very important. And how effective the communication of public interventions can be depending on where the outbreak started, who has been the most effective, and what the role is according to who can make decisions and what are the norms and behaviors in the community. So for this particular disease, no significant differences in gender susceptibility have been reported, and there's also no data available for effects on human pregnancy, animal pregnancy, yes, but no human pregnancy. So with that first example, it gives you a sense that very quickly, without being a gender expert, we can answer some of the key questions when we focus on division of labor, the gender norms of behavior, access and control over decision and resources, just to get a sense of how the intervention, controlling the intervention, can be successful when we include this gender lens. Our second example that I bring to you is the chikungunya fever that is spread with the principal vectors are the Aedes mosquitoes. There's also appears to be a non-human primates as reservoirs, but high viremia can make person-to-person transmission. Sorry, Inda, do you want to say something?
No.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. So the epidemics happen usually during the rainy season, but they have been occurred in all of the continents, you know, including in cases in Europe. The case fatality rate not as high as the Nipah virus, but the susceptibility appeared to be equal in males and females. But population-based surveys that look at seroprevalence demonstrated seroprevalence is much higher for males than for females. And most importantly, that the disease is more prevalent among the poor. As you can imagine, we're talking about mosquitoes as vectors, and housing conditions, sanitation conditions become sort of a big sort of a risk factors for transmission of this disease. It is also important to know that mortality is higher, even though the case fatality rate is relatively low, but the mortality is higher for males and also among the elderly. So that's the intersection that we're talking about with age also here. And unlike Nipah virus, pregnant infected women, based on data from an epidemic in 2005 in Reunion Island, have high miscarriage rates, the greater risk of mother-to-child transmission during delivery. There is neonatal chikungunya infections, And it seems that unlike other viruses, the C-sections do not appear to protect against transmission. But there is so far no evidence of transmission through breastfeeding. So very quickly, sort of a summary of this disease. And what do we want to know when we look at the potential opportunities or challenges when it comes to the gender impact on the disease prevention? So who is closer to mosquito-prone breeding areas, whether it's at households or work sites? It is important to look at some of the gender norms. Who handles the vector control in the household? That person, which in most parts of the world are women, need to be involved in the prevention efforts. They need to be educated on how to prevent. So their involvement in whether it's the use of bed nets, the decrease of habitats for breeding mosquitoes, the spraying, the use of repellents through clothes or sprays, are extremely important roles that women already have because of their roles. So the control of this disease at the household level will be women's responsibility. The access of and control over decision and resources is also important to look at. We talked before that poverty because of housing, poor housing conditions and poor sanitation are risk factors for the disease. So the ability to decide on the expenditures for vector control, so how to allocate resources in the household for vector control is very, very important. Or from a public sector perspective, delivery of promotion interventions, how to target those promotions interventions is very important by understanding the women's involvement in the prevention efforts at the household level. So we know that the response to illness differ for pregnant women. So specific targeting pregnant women with intervention, prevention interventions is extremely important to prevent the poor reproductive outcomes that do happen for both the mother and their newborns if they're born alive. Now, do we have a time for one more?
Yes, yes, we do. Yeah, sure.
Okay, thank you. So just one more example, and it's rabies. You know, very well known for everybody, transmitted to humans from domestic animals through saliva, bites, scratches. Wild animals also have it: foxes, bats, raccoons, skunks. 90% of human rabies are attributed to dog bites. That's what the World Health Organization mentioned. Dog rabies threatens over 3 million people in Asia, in Africa, and is estimated 31,000 deaths per year due to rabies in Asia. So not an insignificant burden of disease. The susceptibility is higher for children. You see that most of is transmitted to dog bites, and children under age of 15, especially boys, tend to be more bitten by the dogs. There is an animal rabies vaccine, and there is also human post-exposure prophylaxis that can be affected, and the data shows that more than 40% of the post-exposure prophylaxis, when given, is given to children between the ages of 5 and 14, and the majority of them are males. However, because the roles and the responsibilities, this is in general, worldwide, but because the roles and responsibilities in each country vary. And let's take an example of Bangladesh, that we've heard before that the macaques are sort of part of the wildlife, are very close to women in Bangladesh. So imagine a situation where an infected bat will bit the macaque, and the macaques that are closer to women because of their roles and responsibilities in food preparation, and they Macaques tend to be always hungry. Scratch a female, adult female, and then starts a disease outbreak from there. So those are the things on how the importance is to look at those diseases, and when you go on and sort of to study or to map out a disease outbreak, to think about the gender roles is extremely important for us to better understand and move forward. So I hope that with these 3 cases, even though I went very fast, you get a sense of how to go into those questions, ask the questions, answer the questions, and have that into consideration in prevention and control of diseases. So, so in rabies specifically, who looks after domestic animals, who is close to the wildlife that can potentially be infected, the gender norms and behaviors, awareness of the dog bite. If a young boy or a young girl is bitten by a dog, most likely the first person in the household to know will be the mother. That will clean the wound. But so knowing what to do and take to the post-exposure prophylaxis is extremely important. So any other practices that lead women to get into contact with wildlife, I mentioned the example of Bangladesh with the macaques and women, but in Africa, for example, because we also have quite a bit of rabies, the burden of rabies in human rabies in Africa. For example, a general practice whereby women in the village believe that feeding foxes will improve your, like fox in the wild, will improve their fertility. So they will get pregnant sooner, faster, if they feed foxes. So again, a situation whereby if the fox is infected, then scratches the woman or through saliva exposure, then you can start an outbreak for that. But if we don't ask what the norms and behaviors are of women with respect to wildlife, we will never know that that is the case, and how to then educate women on the risks that do exist. Again, the decisions of resources and ability to decide when to take the affected people to the hospital is extremely important, because again, for the most part, women are the ones that take care of the sick in most of the countries. Now, I mentioned the gender analysis matrix for disease transmission in first webinar. It basically summarizes in a very easy way in a table all of what I just said, and you can have one small table for each of the diseases that you are working with. So it is also important, because you remember that Dr. Kevin mentioned all of the surveys that they did and how they divided all the norms and practices with respect to the environment and the wildlife by gender. Because I truly believe that gender in monitoring and evaluation activities with respect to infectious diseases can reveal and explain gender differences. Now, but I want you to make a distinction between the sex disaggregated indicators that we are used to and the gender responsive indicators, as I'm calling them. So the sex disaggregated indicators are usually associated with what Dr. Assam has said, related to sort of the epidemiology of the disease, and also some of the biological characteristics, the prevalence of the disease, the incidence, the number treated, the mortality, morbidity, knowledge, attitudes, and practices about the disease, and the symptoms. And sometimes even the symptoms can be subdivided by sex, so that we see which sex which symptoms are more prevalent within each sex. but also the healthcare seeking behavior and the service utilization, knowing that women tend to come more often for healthcare. Now, the gender responsive indicators are indicators that we create with that are associated with the condition that we are dealing with and reveal some of those norms, attitudes, and behaviors that can differ by gender in a given community, given the context, the social cultural context of each community. So the easy one among pregnant women that is important, but the percent of women who make decisions about the healthcare for themselves or for the children, the percent who perceive butchering is a risky activity, and you can calculate that percentage among men and among women, similar to what Kevin has demonstrated in the graphs that he mentioned. It's also important to look at percent reached with prevention intervention and the percent reached among men and among women, but also the percent who changed practices after information prevention intervention. Again, percentage for women among women and percentage among men. So these are some of the illustrative indicators, but again, as I mentioned, the gender responsive indicators are estimated or designed according to the condition and circumstances for each of the disease. So just to wrap up, I hope that at this point, because we are close to the end of the second webinar, that we all understand that gender roles are important. And looking at the gender roles for the disease transmission can provide important insights into differences in factors associated with those disease transmission. And that can contribute to a better, faster, more effective prevention interventions and control of the outbreaks. Analyzing everything by gender can contribute to a more detailed understanding of risk behavior and critical control points for zoonotic diseases. So thank you very much. It has been really a pleasure participating in these webinars. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Indola, for wrapping up really nicely throughout. So it's basically from the talk in the previous webinar and then today. So we really truly appreciate you sharing your thoughts, your experience, and your expertise. So we really appreciate that, and thank you again. Okay, so I think we're moving on to the next discussion and Q&A session. So we have been receiving quite a number of questions, either privately sent through the chat to me and also part of the team. And also there are also a number of questions in the chat box. So I'm going to start off with, let me go to the first question from Sajida. Okay, so from Dr. Kevin's presentation, okay, so probably Stephanie and team can take this one. When he touched more on females could be the drivers for education in their community, I was wondering how would constructing a more inclusive policy helps in advocating for this? Okay, so did you get the question, Stephanie?
Sorry, is it possible to type the question in the chat?
Oh, okay, yeah. So
or is it there?
It's already in the chat box. It's one of the, it's for the first question from Sajida. Oh, sorry. Oh, it was privately addressed to me. All right, hang on. I'll put it in the chat box, yeah?
So it's so the question is,
okay, there you go. I put it.
Females being
could be the drivers for education in their community, as mentioned by Kevin just now. So how would constructing a more inclusive policy would help in advocating for this?
I feel inclined to throw this over to the conservation health team, as they know the local context better than myself. I'm wondering, Tom, Mayho, or Valtteri, if you have any insights into sort of this idea, and if you have any examples of maybe interventions that have been targeted towards females in the Kinabatangan community, or perhaps more broadly, and what you've seen maybe as successes or maybe not successes.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think we've actually got a similar question higher up. So I think I'm going to take the first question first, actually, because it then feeds onto this. So someone asked, regarding the research conducted in Kinabatangan, does it mean that female and males are achieving gender equality in that area, as most of the questions have near even distribution of both genders giving the same answers? If yes, does it relate to educational programs conducted in the area, and how are these educational programs carry out? So these two questions are quite similar. So are females and males achieving gender equality in the Kinabatangan? I don't think I am qualified to answer that. We haven't done enough work in that area. What I will say is that in the kampongs that we were visiting and working in, which were predominantly Bilit and Sukau, there is a lot of ecotourism, and the women in those communities are very much involved in that. So that may have something to do with the differences that we see here compared to other communities that have maybe less contact with tourists and foreigners. We went to great lengths to make sure that we had a survey team, a questionnaire team, which, as Kevin touched on, was made up of equal numbers of males and females, so that we could have females interviewing females. And we had a team that had worked in the area in the past, and we had as well. So there's a lot of trust with the community, which I think probably also factored in to us getting good responses from women. And we also went to great lengths in kind of socializing these questionnaires with these communities to make sure that we were talking to women, talking to the kind of female leaders in the communities to make sure that they were aware of what was going on and they were included, just as we did with the Ketawal kampongs and the male leaders of the community. So coming back to how we conducted our educational program was very much around zoonosis, land use change, the risks of hunting and butchering, and how that kind of activity can be done more safely. And I think it's important to point out, while obviously we all wish that there would be no wildlife hunting, but for many people this is a source of protein, and at no point are we trying to tell people they cannot hunt. We are telling people how they can do it more safely. So our educational programs were really limited to that. So as I said at the start, I don't really think that had any impact on gender. But coming back to that original question, was, how could we construct more inclusive policies? Yeah, I think it is something that needs to be thought about. I think there are examples of it in Malaysia, and it's definitely something that should be considered as we move forward with trying to engage more with communities along these lines.
And if I could just add on a point, not specific to Malaysia, but a little bit more global, it's such a wonderful finding, fact, insight that in many contexts, women are really well placed to be drivers of education sort of in their families and in their communities. I also think that there's a double-edged sword to this, in which interventions have to be careful of not overburdening women as a focal point of interventions. Like if there are 10 different zoonotic disease-focused programs that are in one community, and all of them understand women have this are this wonderful asset, and all of them are asking women to be sort of the educators in the community, that is overburdening them. And that's also something that generally we want to be really mindful of and cognizant of with intervention development, which is why I think an important question in surveys and in interviews and in focus groups to ask is about the history of previous interventions in the context. So you could see, first of all, what existed, what worked or what didn't, and who it was targeted towards, that you can avoid sort of these pitfalls that come from a really good place, but that might inadvertently actually end up hurting rather than helping. And then to answer the second question that Tom grouped this with, I wouldn't say that the questions in any of the surveys that we use are really looking at gender equality or inequality in that sense. But I think that what we saw in the graphs and what we're seeing in our data is really setting the stage for further ways in which we could consider the analyses in the future. So we're seeing things as relatively equal. I think that's encouragement to delve deeper into the data, and in the context of this particular project, like look, how does the gender breakdown potentially differ across different land use gradients or different factors of interest for our particular study. So it's sort of, even though it's equal, I don't think that's the end of the story. Even if it looks equal, that's not the end of the story. It's more of an open door to expand the analysis and to ask more questions.
Yeah. So Dr. Rahaiza or Prof. Indola, would you want to add anything to that? Dr. Rahaiza?
Thank you, Ina. I have no points to add on these issues. Yeah. I think Stephanie has given a good points on that.
And Prof. Indola? Okay. All right. So thank you for the questions. So next up is well, it's addressed to again Kevin and Stephanie. So most of the risk factors for diseases, which is very much related to socio-cultural, is very difficult for intervention. So the way forward is to highlight and focus on gender role is through implementation research by determining the barriers or obstacles within social cultural aspects to further designing the intervention and evaluation. Do you have any comments on this? So who wants to start?
I agree that it's incredibly difficult to create tools that are responsive to really getting sort of at the nuances and the nitty-gritty of the right questions to be asking, which is why I think there's so much work that should and needs to be done at the beginning during the initial phases of survey tool development, of interview and focus group guide development. I think that there's immense value in making sure that there's gender parity in locally comprised research teams, so as they're creating these tools. And I also think that there's such an important role to play for local informants, so people from the communities where you know that these programs are going to be done and this research is going to be conducted, whenever possible, to bring them in to also contribute to the development of these tools, so that the right questions are being asked, so that the right options are being represented as options for the questions, and so that certain sensitivities or questions that that people just won't answer because it's too sensitive are avoided or are framed in sort of a different way. And I think that gets also to a point that Kevin made earlier on, which is One Health is, I think we have our standard definition of One Health, but my sort of personal interpretation of One Health is that it's about breaking silos, and I think such an important part of that in breaking silos is bringing as many voices as possible to the table when it comes to talking about these really big global health challenges that we're all facing together as like one global community. And an important component of that is making sure that there's wonderful gender representation, and that among the gender representation that there are really important intersections that are represented during the start of research and program design. So thank you so much for that question. It is hard, but hard work is important work. So thank you.
Yeah. So we also have a Prof. Rashid actually on, who can jump in whenever if you feel like responding to certain issues or comments. So yeah. So okay. Do we have any additional comments from Prof. Indola following that? All right. Okay. So there's a couple of other questions. Okay, so this is for Prof. Indola. Okay. So due to gender division of labor, there is an increased susceptibility to different genders depending on exposure. So if you were to ask a woman to do the man's job and vice versa, would that just be switching the susceptibility from one gender to the other? Yeah, that's an interesting question. So yeah. I think you need to unmute Prof. Indola. Sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Thank you for the question. I did see in the chat, so I was just waiting for you to mention. It is important to know that by doing this analysis, by taking a gender lens and assessing roles and responsibilities that affect susceptibility to disease, that is not to say that we need to change roles, because that wouldn't change the overall sort of a way in which we look at susceptibility, but is to understand the roles that are associated with each gender, so we can better circumvent and design prevention strategies that address the specific roles that each gender have. So I don't want us to think that, oh, because women are more susceptible, then we change sort of their activities. That is not the goal. The goal is to understand the roles and responsibilities, how that affects susceptibility and exposure to disease, so we can better address and design prevention and other public health interventions to control the disease.
okay. Thank you, Prof. Ndola. Dr. Rahizat?
Well, I agree with the points that Prof. Ndola mentioned, that we propose some interventions from what we have found, that certain roles give more susceptibility to the disease. So it's like it's something like we advocate them to adopt, and this is about adopting and adapting process in advocations. They don't have to change everything, but in terms of like, for example, if we have no choice, but we have to do those things, we have to continue doing that, but it causes a very high risk to certain gender, then dividing the roles, okay, not 100%, but dividing the roles and the risk is a good idea. It means that adapting rather than you 100% adopt and change everything. Yeah, that's my comment.
Yeah. Okay. So in relation to that, there is a comment from Prabhatipa. So as epidemiologists, we often think of gender as an important co-founder because we want to control for biological differences without really thinking over gender functionality and variations of role in the community and society. All right, so another, okay, so the rainbow model reminds me of the progression of vulnerability model that we use in disaster risk management. So that was a comment from Gay. Yeah. All right.
Ooh,
okay.
Can I add in a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sorry.
I really appreciated seeing the the rainbow model on the screen. Actually, I haven't seen the rainbow model before, but it reminded me. It felt like a cousin of this the socio-ecological model. And I think in terms of thinking about intervention development, it's such a useful way to not only think about sort of the questions that we want to ask and the analyses that we want to do, but also such a useful way for us to think about how interventions can be formed. Because certainly there's an argument at each sort of level, I think, of the rainbow model and of the socioeconomic model to, to have interventions that focus on personal decisions or on the community or at the policy level, in addition to interventions that kind of cross the boundaries of all of them. So I think that's such a great graphic and a helpful visual.
Yeah, I mean, it's my first time. It's the first time for me seeing that. So it's good to, I'm going to start to dig into that chart and then I'm trying to look into the details. So yes, thank you so much, Stephanie, for that. All right, so I'll take, okay, right, this question here from Gordon from Packers Trust. Okay, so I have a question regarding the Kina Batangan case studies. So I think that rings for Stephanie and team. So it seems that the majority of the community in Kina Batangan has not been into the forest. Is it because the forest has been converted into oil palm plantation, or because the community are off limits to access to the forest? Okay, thank you.
Maybe Tom Mayhoe-Velsry, if you want to take that question.
Oh, hi, Gordon. That's a good question. So yeah, obviously around the area where we're working with Kina Batangan, which is Billet and Supau, there is a lot of plantations, and that does employ a lot of people in those communities. And I said earlier, there's a lot of ecotourism as well, which also was employing a lot of people in those communities. Obviously, not so much now with COVID-19 and the impacts that that's had on tourism. So in that area, I mean, yes, there are forest reserves, but there is also plenty of places for people to access the forest. I don't think that's the case, that the communities are kept out.
Okay. So don't think that's the case. Yeah. So when it comes to yeah, Stephanie, do you want to add to that?
Nope, nothing to add. That was great.
Okay. Prof. Rashid, any comments on that? Yeah. Okay. All right. So thank you very much for addressing that one. Okay. So let's move on to the next question. Okay. All right. This one was addressed in private to me. Hang on. Okay. Throughout. Okay. Okay. So far from the works that you have done, what's the measure of success in terms of sensitizing the communities involved in disease prevention? Has the gender disparity reduced in terms of gaining access and knowledge to curb zoonotic transmissions in these communities? So yeah, who wants to take that question?
I can talk about something that we're working on right now.
Okay.
So one of the products that came out of Predict, and it's something that we're still using, is a moderated picture book called Living Safely with Bats. And it's really neat. It's sort of like a calendar, like one of those like stand-up calendars that you put on your desk. And it's meant to facilitate community discussions across communities of different backgrounds, different ages, different literacy levels, where there's a really vivid picture of some sort of human bat interface facing the audience. And on the back are talking points. And the idea is that a moderated or a trusted community person or a leader who's already been trained is talking about sort of each of the subject that each page represents. And so that was created under Predict as sort of a programmatic tool. And something that we're really working on now is we want to see how effective it is as a One Health educational resource, because it was something that we developed in close collaboration with the communities in the very different areas that we were working in, where people were regularly interfacing with bats. In addition to scientists from all of the countries, from most of the countries in Predict, and also scientists at EcoHealth Alliance, UC Davis, and other consortium partners. And so it's evidence-based. We think it's really pretty and really neat. And something that we really want to do is measure its impact. So with our local collaborators right now, we've been developing sort of a mixed methods survey tool that goes back and forth between asking questions with like a finite number of responses and also open-ended questions. And the idea is we want to, before someone is presented with the book, ask them generally about, what is your knowledge regarding the ecosystem services of bats? What are your attitudes towards towards conservation and the environment? And what do you know about diseases that maybe we can get from bats? And subjects that are touched over the course of this somewhat long book. And the idea is that we would ask these before and after the presentation of the book and programming that happens around the book. And so at this point, what we are seeing as our measure of impact would be changes in knowledge, attitudes, skills, and behaviors as a result. I think that causal link will be really hard to make because of a picture book, but we really do want to measure if knowledge, attitudes, skills, and behaviors change over the course of the presentation of the book and the programming that happens around the book. So in the context of some of the work that I've been a part of at EcoHealth Alliance, those are really what we're looking at. Are people's knowledge of different risky behaviors changing? Are people's attitudes? So, that question that Kevin showed, like, oh, it's very risky. It's not that risky. Those sorts of questions that really get at perception, we're trying to see whether those change over time as a result of exposure to certain educational tools. I'm so sorry for my background noise.
So okay, yeah. I mean, I think I saw it once. The bats, living with bats. The educational tools. I really think it's such a great tool to empower those communities that you are going to target. So yeah, and then in
Can I
relation,
just add
yeah,
quickly? Sorry,
yeah,
those
sure.
living safely with bat books, we've had them translated into Malay, Chinese,
Yeah.
Discern, and actually yesterday we just finished our Murut version.
Oh,
So
yeah.
the Malay, Discern, Chinese versions are available on the conservationmedicine.org website. People can download them and distribute them,
Right.
and we'll be putting the
Okay.
Murut one up there in the next week or so.
Mm-hmm.
And just wanted to say one other thing. The question originally about whether we should target zoonosis training in communities to one gender or the other. I think it's important that we target it to the community as a whole. These are community-based problems, and as with most problems we have, it's up to communities, not one gender, to solve those problems. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, that's a very important point as well. And all right, because there are two questions related to training of future workforce over here. So we've got one. What kind of changes would you like to see in our university curriculum, especially among health-related degrees, to ensure that gender differences is emphasized? Okay, so probably Dr. Raizat.
Okay. Regarding the changes, it's just like how we introduce One Health in the beginning into our curriculum. So, in my point of view, that for gender, basically, I would like to see the emphasis on research, basically, whether it is undergraduates or postgraduates level, looking into more implementation research or translational research rather than this factor-based kind of research. That's the most important thing now, because my point is that we are trying to introduce something which is known to be non-modifiable factors, because they regard sex as biological. You cannot change the community because male and female is already created by God. So to now we are introducing gender. It is a role, but we have the barriers of socio-cultural. We have the barriers of sometimes it goes to religious. So in the curriculum, we should implement more on implementation research. When we design the research, whether for postgraduate, undergraduates, or mainly for postgraduates, looking at translational. So of course, like what Stephanie mentioned just now, we assess the knowledge, everything in our research, pre and post. But designing further intervention should go direct to the hurdles, to the obstacles, to the barriers for us to tackle these issues. Then the implementations, the designs of implementations is basically tackling the barriers, and that should be measured and evaluated. So that is, I think, the final measurement of the successfulness of the intervention program. So I think that should be, we should start that in our curriculum, especially on the research base. Basically, I
Okay.
focus on the research. Yeah.
Research based. So, for Prof. Ndola, how about the more coursework based curriculum in terms of incorporating?
Can I just interject?
Okay.
I would like to hear Prof. Ndola's view, because Tom said that we should look at the community rather than the gender, and then Rahaizat said the same thing about it's non-modifiable. So I would like to hear what Ndola has to comment about this. Just looking at the community as a whole, or why actually are we looking at the genders aspect? Ndola?
So thank you, Prof. Rashid. I think that when we arrive at the community and are sort of designing projects, especially the ones that Stephanie and Tom have worked on, the first impression is to look at the community. But if you don't break it down and look at gender and their roles, we miss good opportunities to effectively design and address interventions or points of entry to fast sort of reach the solutions with the input of those that are most affected or those that are sort of in the chain of higher susceptibility, bigger exposure, etc. So it's not do one or the other, is that in order to address One Health, we have to do both. That is my personal opinion. And also backed up by studies and science that a comprehensive approach is needed to get there in the best solution. With respect to the last question about sort of changes in the curriculum, I agree with Professor Roy that it is very important that we include in all trainings sort of what I like to call the gender lens when it comes to studying health or studying One Health at every point. And it can start small, but you know, at the PhD level, of course, it gets a little bit more complex. But I also want to mention that because I'm part of the One Health Next Generation program, I'm actually the gender leads in One Health Next Generation. And MyOHUN is part of that network, that the one of the One Health competencies is gender. And ideally, over time, all of the trainees in One Health would have from levels 1 to 4 the gender competencies. There's 3 gender competencies, and all of them should have at least level 2 of the 3 competencies.
If I could add on just one more idea. I'm not a professor, so I'm not speaking from the same expertise, but just in terms of the work that I've been a part of. So I think it's so, especially for those who are in undergrad or grad school, I think it's so important for you to think about the skills that you're building as a future researcher. And something that I would really love to see, and I don't know exactly where this would be incorporated into curriculum, is a lesson or coursework built around understanding the biases that we bring into research. Just outside of EcoHealth, but just like in my public health life, I've been a part of studies where, you know, someone can be from a certain country, and so, you know, you might kind of off the bat think that, okay, they'll be sensitive to, you know, understanding like local norms and customs when interviewing someone from a community in the country, but that's not always the case, especially, you know, if the researcher has grown up their entire life in a city or another part of the country, and they go to another region, there can be a disconnect there. And so I'm thinking of Dr. Prata's example of the interfacing with the foxes. That example, I feel like there have been cases that I've seen where someone who encountered someone telling a local perception or a local belief like that, if you are not trained to check your own biases and to be sensitive to people who are sharing, you know, potentially deeply held local beliefs, you might maybe laugh at it a little bit, or you might not be trained to take that as a really important bit of research and continue to probe on that. And I think that's not something that everyone inherently knows how to do, because we all have our biases. So something that I think would be so important for future One Health researchers is to go through exercises or to take research courses that that kind of touch on this topic of what to do if you're not from that community and how best to be sensitive going about the research, because those local perceptions and local practices that might be very foreign to you are so important to record in a way with great integrity.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie. Yeah, so we've got a comment from Prabhupada. Interestingly, gender is not one of the One Health core competencies for Southeast Asia. It is for One Health Africa. Okay, so probably something that we could be diving more into that for future plans, so or in the near time. And in relation to the question just now, so I think what are the things that we, as in students, undergraduate students, can do to address or raise awareness regarding the issue of gender and One Health. This is like directly from the initiatives of probably like the activities of clubs, for example, rather than embedded within the curriculum. So yeah, Prof. Rashid, since you've spent more time like with the younger students, so yeah.
Well, I tend to usually hang around with people my age, so what exactly? I'm sure I missed the
So the point, so the question is just a role as, I mean, coming from, this question is coming from a student, I believe an undergraduate. So what can they do to address or maybe raise the awareness in terms of, making more comfortable introducing gender when addressing any One Health issues?
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
For the projects that we've been doing with the indigenous people, I always use that as a great example because the disparities that you see between the two genders is amazing. But what is more important is that it's not that one gender is lesser or more at risk or more advantage or disadvantage compared to the other. They all play a role. That's how the society, which Annie was talking about, which I really, really agree with her completely, is first look at the society that you're going to, look at what the society and what the norms of the society are. Do not judge based on what you are used to. You need to understand the society that works for them. Like for the indigenous people, it works for them, for the men to go out hunting when they come back, and for the women to prepare the bushmeat. So both are actually at risk. So to target one or the other is wrong. Is also to bring your biases and your ideas in coming in and emphasizing that this is how it should work. And that's another thing that we should make sure that we do not do that. So I guess start small, baby steps. Understand first that what your beliefs and your practices are is not perfect. Go some what I when I was young. Oops, I shouldn't have used that one. I'm still young. When I was much younger, I guess. So what we used to, what I learned from someone senior for me was that when we would sit down, we'll always ask the elder, "I've come here to learn from you." And you see that they'll open up and they'll tell you so much. And I've seen that my much younger people who follow me and do this, they see the same thing that I do. When I sit down, I sit with the elderly, and first thing I say is, I've come to learn from you. So what I would suggest the younger researchers to do is do this. The first thing is go there with the sense that I've come to learn, not I've come to teach you or I've come to change your mindset. I've come to learn. So I think that's the first step that everybody should do.
Inda, can I add
Yeah,
a
sure,
little bit?
sure.
Thank you. I completely agree, Professor Rashid. I've been in those types of situations, and learning from the community is the best way for an entry point so that we can intervene. We might come with a medical sort of a knowledge on how to treat this disease, but we don't understand for the most part, and we need to be open to even be surprised on how the roles and responsibilities might affect in ways that we haven't seen yet. And those roles and responsibilities, we also have to be aware that they change over time. And I'm going back to one of the questions here in the chat by Gabrielle. Assessing those roles and responsibilities over time as communities evolve, as more education comes to those communities, and eventually they realize the benefits of that education and change their own practices. and sometimes even beliefs on their own, because they see the benefit to changing some of those practices. We use specific tools to do what we call the gender assessments, and those tools can then guide us over time. We can adjust them to measure that. Let me just give you an example, because I'm also apart from the gender, our maternal, child, and adolescent health field, and when I was, like Dr. Rashi said, much younger, when I finished medical school and started to work in a community, I was the only doctor. And all of the trainings on childhood immunization, the education about the importance, the schedule of immunization and everything, we gave it to the mothers, because the mothers were the one taking care of the babies and making decisions, taking them to the immunizations, remember what to do, going to campaigns, or directly in routine sort of visits. Fast forward 10 years, with all campaigns of male involvement, younger fathers, in their 20s, started to be the ones bringing their children. So we had to change practice. Even without doing surveys, when you see in your health center and in your sort of immunization campaigns, a lot of male coming into with their kids for immunization, then you immediately change practices, that then you provide information to all, men and female equally, because the roles evolve, as I mentioned in the beginning. Sex doesn't, but the roles evolve. And we, as part of the healthcare system, or as part of the One Health system, we need to evolve with that too in our interventions.
Yeah. So yeah, this there's a question that is really relevant to the previous point that you made. So in the role, as evidence in different countries, for example, with more women joining the military or men asserting rights for paternity leave, we need to be able to be on track with the transition, so that we'll be on top of the shifts in vulnerability and exposure to zoonosis. Are there any practical tools that we can use to monitor the shifts, and how often should we track these?
So we do have tools that can be adjusted for specific contexts, but MyOHUN can have these tools available, and the tracking, the timing for the tracking will depend on the visible changes that you see in society. So you're not going to track if 3 men change, right? Or 3 women change. But if you see big shifts in waves, like, for example, the number of men in X activities have now changed, and now we have, they used to be 99% men and few women, and now we have 70% men and 30% women. Then we have to change and do the reassessment again.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Prof. Indula. So yeah, there was a comment on relating to Stephanie's comment just now. Cultural understanding is definitely one of the major One Health core competencies, but often missed on research, conduct, and operations. So, I mean, we had a very active and lively discussion session. Unfortunately, time is not with us. So I am going to come to the final questions and final thoughts to each of our presenters for today. So for Stephanie, we understand that PREDICT was not primarily looking at gender risks in zoonotic infections, but as you mentioned, you found specific gender risks from your experience. So what would be your advice to researchers who are involved in zoonotic research in terms of gender-related risks?
I think there's a lot to say about this. I really love Dr. Prata's point that you don't need to be an expert. So I think making sure that during the recruitment stages of your team, but also during the training stages at that point is really impressed upon the admin staff, the research staff, sort of everyone who's involved, that it's sort of on everyone to kind of keep it in front of mind as you're going through your work. but that it's not a shortcoming if you don't have someone who's like, you know, a LinkedIn gender expert on your team, because of how integral it is. It's a skill that I think that everyone should have. And then in addition to that, I guess I really, again, want to emphasize the point that Dr. Olival made, that considering gender in research shouldn't be an afterthought. It shouldn't be just something that you build into a survey in the beginning and then you analyze, you know, male, female at the end. It's so much more than that. You know, it's again about research design, program design, it's about tool design, it's about how it's approached, and then if something's not working, how it's modified over the course of the project. It really needs to stay front and center. It's also about like the analysis at the end, that you're not just looking at how things fall along the categories that you've chosen, but also how it intersects with the other important categories of your research, whether that be, you know, marital status and certain exposures, or geography or movement, in addition to gender. So don't be worried if you don't have anyone who's a quote unquote gender expert, because we should all try to be experts in our own lives about it in our research. And also don't regard gender as an extra thing or as an afterthought, and rather just center it and make sure it's integrated into sort of everything that you're doing. And I think that'll set everyone up for success. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. So for Dr. Rahizat, so as a public health expert, and by your own admission, we in Malaysia are not looking at gender-related risks when conducting research related to zoonotic infections. What would be your suggestions to change this? You need to unmute, sorry.
Sorry, just to repeat what I've mentioned, that in terms of changing the directions of the research is one thing, but I think my next comment, my final comments is related to what Prof. Rashid and Prof. Andola mentioned about for as early as the undergraduates, we try to emphasize on the gender, and in my opinion that we try not to introduce this gender role in infectious disease as something very new. To me, it's not something new and something impossible to be conducted. Let's make a comparison with one of the issues in relation to gender and culture in certain populations. So I would like to go back to be young, like Prof. Rashid also. We have a problem with contraceptions in the community, which we have a lot of issues of the gender roles. Of course, male is dominant, the father is dominant in decision making, and then and we know the risk of having too many kids, something like that. So, and it crossed the culture and religion. But now you can see they have shifted. Now I think the father is asking for contraceptions, if you can see more, because of the advocation that we give in terms of what are the risks, what are the benefits, and involve all parties looking into the child health and mother's health, looking into the economy. So I think the approach for introducing the gender role in infectious disease goes along that way. I think for the beginners, even for the beginners, for the undergraduate students, learn from the story, the success story of advocating contraceptions in the community into this. I think this is not something new. We just adapt with the structure, and then we can go on. So it is possible.
Thank you, Dr. Rahizat. As for Prof. Andola, I'm going to interweave one of the last question from to your final key points. So by the end of this webinar, we now know that the importance of looking at gender. Could you nicely sum up what we can do to increase the awareness of this among future One Health workforce? And then if you would be able to share one of your most memorable research milestones that you have achieved so far in terms of gender research and zoonotic diseases. Okay.
Wow, that was a lot. So in terms of increasing awareness for gender, so as Stephanie mentioned, I feel like I'm on a campaign to say that you don't need to be a gender expert in order to introduce in your classes, in your programs, in your community work, gender and a gender lens by asking the questions I mentioned here, by looking at matrices, by just being inquisitive. The idea is that we don't become or continue to be gender blind. We become gender aware. Whether or not we are experts now or not, we can all ask those questions, and we all have methodologies, whether quantitative or qualitative, to assess and ask those questions to the community, learn from the community so we can better design programs. So being gender aware is the first step. And then we become experts. You don't need to be an expert in order to study gender or introduce gender. You introduce gender slowly, and then you become an expert. That is my, I think, pathway to make headways at all levels in our careers, from students all the way to teachers, directors of programs, etc. So the last part in terms of a successful story. I think one of the most recent epidemics of Ebola in sub-Saharan Africa, this one specifically in Liberia, where sort of the understanding of the importance of gender has been sort of a critical sort of a point, and those of us who we call them, we always push the gender lens. In multidisciplinary teams with the epidemiologists and other public health professionals, you see the success in being able to better control the epidemic because we understand gender roles, and that leads to a much faster progress in the control of the disease. Or of course, other things matter too. I mean, it's not just gender that's going to control an epidemic. Of course, you need supplies, you need the healthcare, the infrastructure, etc. But the one of the factors for success of control of a disease, of a zoonotic disease, is understanding the gender roles.
Okay.
And we've seen that improvement in the more recent epidemic, especially in sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Prof. Ndola. So after this, we can all become advocates for. You do not need to become gender experts to incorporate, to add the lens, to zoom into gender when we are doing our projects, research, or even when teaching our students. So yes, we have benefited a lot. Today, we have learned so much from all of the panel of speakers, and then we hope that this is not going to be the last activity. I mean, in terms of advocating gender and into One Health. So we are looking forward to be having more events in the future, and this is just the beginning. For Malaysia, for MyOHUN, and then hopefully this will kickstart to much more, a wave of more activities, more trainings, more education activities, incorporating gender and One Health. So I would really like to take this opportunity to thank all of the speakers and also participants for staying, even though we went a bit over time, but I think we don't really mind because we have learned so much. It's a very insightful session. So before we go, I would like to remind you that for participants, please click on the link that is being put in the chat box over here to register your attendance. Okay, I'm just going to tap it. All right. Okay. So yeah. So Prof. Rashid, do you want to have your few final words before we close?
Yep. It's I mean, if you look at the webinars that we've conducted, is from the start of what is gender and to where we are now. It would seem that, you know, a lot of people think that it's a norm here in MyOHUN, but you'd be surprised that since MyOHUN started, this is actually the first time that we are incorporating gender and gender issues into MyOHUN projects. But for someone who wasn't aware of that, you would think that, you know, MyOHUN is very actively involved in gender and gender matters. For that, I would really, really like to credit our coordinator, Professor Latifa, for her foresight in getting gender off the ground. I thought we were far behind all the other countries, but from the meetings that we've been having, that, you know, Malaysia's MyOHUN seems to be leading it. So a big thank you to our coordinator, Prof. Latifa, and to all the MyOHUN gender team. And of course, we have our gender expert. You don't have to be experts, but our gender expert, Prof. Ndola, who's been such a good friend and who's been guiding us. This is not the end. There will be a field training. Unfortunately, because of COVID, we can't get our international friends to join us. But we will be doing, hopefully, maybe a few more webinars if time and money permits, and then we will see how things go from there. But I'd like to thank every single one who has participated, MyOHUN and beyond. And with that, thank you very, very, very much.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Rashid. And yes, so with that, again, thank you very much for staying us up until the end. Have a good day and take care. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Noor. Thank you so much. You've been a wonderful moderator.
Thank you. Thank you,
Yes.
Prof. Ndola.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you
you,
again for
Stephanie.
inviting me.
Yeah.
Thank you very
Yes.
much. Okay.
Pleasure to have
Thanks.
all
Bye
of you.
bye.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you to the Predict team, all of the Predict team who is present today.